I did look Agnes Cumming up and thought with great pleasure, my goodness, she reminds me a little bit of Dorothy Sayers, another heroine of mine, one of the very first women graduates of Oxford. Had to wait 10 years before they gave her the degree. But, okay, this is part one. I begin with the quotation from William James. The progress of science has seemed to mean the enlargement of the material universe and the diminution of man's importance. The result is what one may call the growth of naturalistic or positivistic feeling. Man is no longer lawgiver to nature, he is an absorber. She it is who stands firm, he it is who must accommodate himself. The romantic spontaneity and courage are gone. The vision is materialistic and depressing. But you want a system that will combine both things, the scientific loyalty to facts and willingness to take account of them, but also the old confidence in human values. That was written in 1906, which was a very long time ago. It's amazing, despite all the cultural changes, how resonant it still is. We still need a philosophy that can accommodate that admirable loyalty to facts and those desirable human values. But I'm going to stress something that James doesn't, which is both of those attitudes can take indefensible forms. Tender-minded reservations, he has this wonderful image of the tender-minded and the tough-minded. I keep asking myself, which am I? And the only possible answer is, both. Tender-minded reservations about science sometimes turn into anti-scientific resentment. And tough-minded admiration for science sometimes turns into scientism. Moreover, it's not just a matter of temperament, as James thought. I think it's more important that both scientism and anti-science rest on misconceptions about science and its place in culture. Here's Peirce. A man must be downright crazy to make doubt that science has made many true discoveries. Well, yeah, I agree. In fact, I once used that as the closing quotation of a paper on feminist philosophy of science, and I remember went on, or a woman. Of course, but science is a human enterprise. And as Denis Diderot said, man is made up of insight and blindness, pettiness and grandeur. When I wrote Defending Science in 2003, the greater danger seemed to be anti-scientific cynicism. And much of the book is a critique of those ideas. But now, as far as I can tell, scientism seems to be everywhere on the rise, including in philosophy. And a brief paper I wrote on this phenomenon in 2010, 6 Signs of Scientism, now seems to me to need revisiting. It's not that I've changed my mind about anything I said there, but I don't think it went deep enough. So, the English word science once just meant systematized knowledge. You could use it, for example, of jurisprudence. People would write about the science of jurisprudence with no sense of oddity. But in the late 19th century, it narrowed so that it applied to what we now call the sciences specifically. Initially, only the physical sciences, later including the social sciences. And now it's usual to distinguish the natural from the social sciences. I see the sciences as a loose federation of interrelated kinds of empirical inquiry. And I take inquiry to be the core business of the sciences. I know scientists do a million other things, notably applying for grants. attending seminars on how to write a grant application, reading other people's grant submissions, and so on. But no, the core business is inquiry. That's what the grants are for. But what do we have in common, besides the fact that deans and librarians classify them together? I would say, well, a sort of family resemblance, but not a unique shared method or anything of that order. Rather, I would say, the boundaries of science are fuzzy, shifting, and often contested. Often reasonably contested. So what, if anything, is distinctive about scientific inquiry? I've been scratching my head about this for years and years and years. Here is the upshot. Is it something unprecedented in the history of the human race? Something completely new that somehow burst on the scene in the 17th century? Or is it something familiar and routine? Neither. It has its roots in everyday inquiry, I think, but it's gone far beyond it. The best analogy I can think of is, it's a bit like beef bourguignon or Moglai chicken, which go way beyond the first primitive attempts at cooking. Or Shakespeare or the modern novel, which go way beyond anything like primitive storytelling by the people who would recite the legends of the tribe to an illiterate people. Today, this idea sounds radical. We've had much of a century of philosophy about the scientific method. So today, this sounds like something radical. Not really. It would have been entirely familiar to Thomas Huxley, for example, Darwin's bulldog, they used to call him. Or to Albert Einstein, who says science is nothing more than a refinement of everyday thinking. Or Percy Bridgman. The scientific method, insofar as it is a method, is doing one's damnedest with one's mind. No holds barred. John Dewey, who was very, very clear about how science could have grown out of everyday empirical inquiry. And Gustav Bergman, a nearly forgotten Swedish philosopher, fortunately not entirely forgotten because he served at the University of Iowa for many years, and they now have Bergman lectures, who, I don't know much about it except one really good line. Science is the long arm of common sense. Scientists aren't unique in making educated guesses and checking them out so far as they can. Of course not. But over the centuries, they have come up with a vast array of tools, physical tools like instruments of observation, intellectual tools like the calculus, statistics, social tools like a peer review system to try to keep what's published of reasonable quality, incentives and disincentives to punish cheating, and so on. Helps to inquiry, that's Francis Bacon's phrase. Bacon, I might add, was a highly distinguished lawyer. He was Chancellor of England for a while, but he was no scientist. Sir William Harvey wrote of him, he writes about science like a chancellor. Roughly, you know, dear King James, please give me £200 and 20 years and we can solve everything. Right? Which sounds like too many grant applications today, except that you have to add many zeros. Right? But on this topic, I think he was absolutely right. What we need is helps to inquiry, to inquire better. So there's both continuity and discontinuity. There are the same underlying procedures and inferences we use in everyday inquiry, by now enormously improved, amplified, refined, augmented by a constantly evolving array of new tools, new helps. And by now, of course, we've got many generations of scientific work behind us, each of them building on work that went before, which enables better theories, better instruments, better techniques, better experimental design, better computer programs, and so on. There's a simply wonderful book by a woman called Betty Ann Kevles. Its title is Naked to the Bone, and it's about medical imaging technology from the very earliest X-rays to the most modern CAT scans, MRIs, blurred, whatever the next latest thing is. It's really remarkable because at the first level I can sort of understand what's going on. It's Jeffersonian technology and I can figure it out. And then it's step after step from there, making it better and better and fancier and fancier. She also tells us the first time an X-ray was ever used in court. I'll tell you that just because it's such fun. It was in France. Where else? The case was a criminal one. A guy was accused of having shot the milkman who was supposedly having an affair with his, that's to say, the guy's wife. And an X-ray was produced to show that there was indeed a bullet inside this milkman. These helps introduce new ideas, new concepts, new approaches. Then there are new technical helps, better instruments, for example. Think of Darwin. Darwin didn't have any fancy instruments. Some of his measurements he made by lying the specimen against his handkerchief. And he was, okay, this thing's a handkerchief and a half. Well, now they have much fancier tools. Internal social mechanisms that up to a point encourage honesty and evidence sharing. Up to a point is in italics because it's important. But it's not magic. Each step forward enables further steps, correction of past mistakes, and so on. So in a sense, yes, science is self-correcting. But it's not magic. It's generations and generations of effort and frustration and patience. Ideally, there would be consensus in the scientific field that this result is established when and only when the evidence is sufficient. But consensus is very easily distorted by political pressure, by commercial interests, and so on. Not to mention by conservative resistance to new ideas. So, when Darwin first had the idea, species are not fixed. Oh my goodness, you couldn't say this in public. And when he finally wrote to Joseph Hooker saying, I'm sorry, I'm persuaded species are not fixed. It's like confessing a murder, he said, because the biological establishment was going to be furious with him, as indeed it was. Well, think of the resistance that those Australian scientists who suggested maybe ulcers might be caused by a bacterium, not by stress and diet. Right? There was an outcry. Turns out they were right. They eventually won the Nobel Prize, but it took years for this to be accepted. And of course, progress in the sciences is ragged, it's uneven. There is no guarantee science will continue to advance. The sciences are both fallible and incomplete. Moreover, while the technical helps get better and better, almost uniformly, the social helps are actually, I believe, under real strain because the science now is very big, it's very expensive, and it's increasingly bureaucratized. And the results are, as you might expect, the social helps to encourage effort, to encourage creativity, to prevent cheating are weaker. We're operating less well and less well as the pressure on them gets greater. For example, the peer review process is at this point, I think I can say, significantly corrupted. I used to think it's better in the sciences. I know it's ghastly in philosophy, but you know, that's because it's still a field of schools and cliques, and okay, no, but surely it's better in the sciences. Well, honestly, after I read the article that told me, oh my goodness, now much publication, of course, is electronic and submissions are electronic. Some journals, especially in medical fields, will routinely ask authors to suggest referees. I think this is already nuts, but okay, that's what they do. It's happened to me. I'm like, what? You're asking me? Well, okay, but am I going to tell you someone who will say no? Of course not. Okay. Some smart guys have noticed that this system is manipulable, and they have created fake names and institutions and email addresses, and they will send these are the referees I would like you to contact, and of course the request for a report comes straight to them. They have been known to answer within half an hour. This is a brilliant paper, certainly you should publish it. Okay. Well, that is shocking. To the point where one commentator, himself a scientist, writes, if the peer review system is good at anything, it appears to be preventing unpopular ideas from being published. Oh dear. So it's really ironic, I think, that there's a newly aggressive scientism is on the rise exactly when careerism and bureaucracy are threatening the very ideals which have made science the great thing that it's been. Okay. All right. Signs of scientism. I'm going to start by talking about anti-science. See, I really am a moderate. You know, you with this or with that? No, I'm in the middle somewhere. Why do I have to choose? Okay. Anti-science is just as bad as scientism, and I will repeat very briefly a few things I've said before. Anti-science comes in a million variants. There are religious fundamentalists who are dismayed by modern cosmology or dismayed by the theory of evolution. Okay. There are perfectly ordinary people who have read too often in the press of scientific fraud, of corruption in the peer review process, of simply gigantic grants given for projects which sound either incomprehensible or completely banal. And there were, of course, in later years of the 20th century, ambitious sociologists eager to denigrate the achievements of the natural sciences. Among the cynical, there were even some who maintained such concepts as evidence, truth, etc., are ideological humbug, apparently not realizing that if that were true, there couldn't actually be evidence, and it couldn't actually be true, as they said, that science is driven not by evidence, but by power, politics, and rhetoric. Scientism is no less complex, no less various, and no less rife with internal tensions. Some people are just so impressed by scientific achievements that they'll believe anything that has the label scientific. And they will resist any and every criticism of science. And then there's an academic wing of scientism, which includes, going back in history a little bit, those offering criteria of demarcation of science, theories about scientific method and all that. A noisy chorus now. Oh boy, what a racket. Energized by the rise of neuroscience and of evolutionary psychology. Interesting that. Evolutionary psychology used to be called sociobiology, and everybody turned their noses up at it. And then it got a new name, and now it's extremely popular. And a lot of people are urging hitherto uncivilized disciplines like jurisprudence, art history, should look to the sciences for answers. I have read any number of books with titles like neuroart in the last 6 months. What's going on? They keep telling me an artist is really a brain scientist, only he doesn't realize it. What? Here too, there are internal contradictions. For example, the early enthusiasts for neurophilosophy claimed that their approach showed that epistemological questions were misconceived. They thought they'd shown there are no beliefs. Indeed, Paul Churchland actually wrote, "I believe there are no beliefs." Okay? It's like dealing with Rorty, all you have to do is quote him. Now, reductionists are offering a sweeping nihilism. I will talk about this tomorrow. And both of these undermine the very science that they're appealing to. So something has gone wrong. If it's evolutionary psychology and neuroscience that play the largest role in shaping the character of scientism today, I think it is, it appears to be a newly evangelical atheism that sets its tone. There is now a flourishing organization called the Brights. I know this was not their intention. The intention was to find a euphemism for atheist along the lines of gay for homosexual, right? Something that would not be offensive, right? But I think this was a most unfortunate choice of word, because inevitably it conveys the impression that you think religious people are, well, dim, right? I think this newly evangelical atheism has significantly affected the tone of some of the manifestations of scientism today. It's salutary to remember, first of all, it's not obvious that science has shown religious belief to be false. That's, if it's true, is a very hard argument. That there were atheists long before modern science got on its feet, and that religious people sometimes welcome scientific discoveries as actually confirming their position. So think of all the literature on fine-tuning, for example. This association of scientism with atheism conveys the false impression anyone opposed to scientism must have a religious agenda, which is maddening. I don't. I'm against scientism because I think it's mistaken, not because I have a religious agenda to push. Okay. I spoke at a conference in the Netherlands in 2014, a conference on scientism. The first horrific discovery was that they didn't realize the word was pejorative. Oops. The second horrific development was that there was absolutely nobody willing to say science is a good thing, but scientism is not, except myself, who did not have a religious agenda. That was very disturbing, I think. Of course, there is no simple formula to determine when the line has been crossed between appropriate respect for the achievements of science. I have great respect for the achievements of the sciences, and undue deference to science. But there are characteristic indicators. I'm going to start by listing them. Can you read the caption under the thing from the back? What the hell is that supposed to mean? Okay. First of them, forgetting fallibility. That's to say, being ready to accept anything and everything that has the label science. That's a form of credulity. Okay? Credulity about science. Sanctifying science. I mean making science, scientific and so on, generic terms of epistemic praise. Think of that question people are challenged sometimes. Do you have any scientific evidence for that, they say? What they mean is, do you have any good evidence for that? Of course, as soon as you make science an honorific term, all kinds of people want to jump on the bandwagon, right? Management science, for example, I can sort of keep a straight face about that. Mortuary science, I'm sorry, I can't. It appears to me in the art of making corpses look good. But it's not a joke. On a recent visit to Wayne State in Detroit, we were passing a lot of university buildings. They've bought a lot of the wonderful old houses in Detroit that used to belong to the motor car executives. And one of them had a big sign outside, said, "Mortuary science." And of course, creation science. Right? Brilliant piece of rhetoric, but give me a break. Okay. Third sign, fortifying the frontiers, insisting on a strong, sharp line of demarcation between genuine science and pretenders. Of course, the image is meant to convey, I think you're really drawing a line in the sand, but there isn't a clear line to be drawn. Mythologizing method. Supposing that what's distinctive about the sciences is a uniquely scientific way of going about inquiring. This is a bad mistake which has by now infected the US legal system. Dressing up, dreck. Okay. I mean, adopting the tools and the trappings of science in a way that only disguises a lack of rigor. Okay. Actually, I think this also illustrates sanctifying science, doesn't it? Right. Trust me, this is science. Oh, yeah, right. I've got a lot of equipment, but I have no idea what I'm doing. Colonizing culture. That is attempting to displace non-scientific disciplines by scientific work. Okay. The picture is of the cover of a relatively recent book by a man who is by profession a neuroscientist and who has become very concerned that people in his field are losing sight of what makes humans human by insisting it's all somehow or other got to be the brain. Devaluing the different, as to say, denigrating the importance or denying the legitimacy of non-scientific disciplines and activities. Okay. See, it used to be 6, I've now found 7. These roughly parallel the many and various manifestations of scientism I started with, and they're intimately interconnected. For example, the honorific use of science is connected with concern for demarcation. If science is an honorific term, it really matters what counts as science and what doesn't. And the concern with demarcation is tightly connected also with the preoccupation with scientific method, because it's supposed to be a distinctive method that distinguishes science from everything else. Naturally, they also reflect the tensions within scientism. For example, between fortifying the frontiers, which is closing off science, and extending the boundaries, or between trying to colonize the other area of culture and then, well, denigrating what won't behave. Right, what refuses to be colonized. All right, that's just a list, with illustrations, but just a list. What are the false presuppositions behind these signs? There's some temptation, I think, to rely on a trivial verbal truth. Scientism means undue deference to the sciences. So it's a bad thing, right? Trivially. Well, yes, but that doesn't get you anywhere. Right? It's true that it's a sort of tautology. Scientism is a bad thing. But it doesn't tell you what counts as scientism or why it's a bad thing. And I, for one, want to know those two things. Trivial verbal truths never get you very far. It can't tell us either how to spot scientism or why it's undesirable. Okay. Nor is it enough, I think, to point out that scientism poses real dangers to the health of our culture. It does, I agree. But That isn't it by itself an argument that it's mistaken. It's an argument, I don't like it, but not, it's mistaken. What's needed is to identify the misunderstandings on which scientism rests, which will help us understand why it's dangerous. So that's what I'm going to try to do. Forgetting fallibility. Credulity about scientific claims betrays a serious misunderstanding, I think, of how science advances. Not infallible step by infallible step, but by fits and starts, with numerous wrong turns, numerous missteps along the way. It's a human business. It's a fallible human business. They get there in the end, but they can make a lot of mistakes along the way. Yes, the sciences have made many true discoveries. I would not for a moment deny that. But not every scientific claim will be true. In fact, most will turn out to be either false or only approximate, or true enough but misleading because they're focusing on some small element of a larger picture. Sanctifying science betrays a similar misunderstanding of fallibility. Scientific is not equivalent to epistemologically good. And this is very important. Bad science, that's to say, poorly conducted or poorly conceived science, is nevertheless science. It's bad science. It's not something else because it's bad. Not all and not only scientists are good, careful, thorough, creative inquirers. Some scientists have been among the most remarkable inquirers that the human race has ever thrown up. But not every scientist is like that, and certainly not only scientists are like this. Some historians have been, for example, remarkably good, careful, thorough inquirers, even the occasional philosopher. Fortifying the frontiers. Once you realize that there can be poor scientific work as well as good scientific work, the problem of demarcation doesn't look so urgent anymore. It doesn't seem so important, does it? It's just as well because it has proven extremely intractable. I love this picture. Absolutely right. That's how he should have looked. Right? Popper's idea that a theory is scientific if and only if it's falsifiable has been very, very influential. I talked this morning about its influence on our Supreme Court, but it's influential everywhere. If you scratch any scientist of middle age or older and say, tell me about scientific method, you can bet some half-digested Popperism is what you're going to get. Right? It's very strange. It's completely broken-backed. It's hopeless. Actually, I had no idea how hopeless it was. I was naive. I thought it wasn't very good, but I didn't think it was really terrible. Until I undertook to write a paper about the Supreme Court's use of Popper for a legal journal. Now, there's very many weird things about legal journals in the US. They're not peer-reviewed. The editors, who are law students, pick the papers. But every single footnote is double-checked by the student editors. And if your information is incomplete or inaccurate, you will get a very embarrassing letter from them saying, this is incorrect, please fix it. It's really shocking the first time. One of the things I learned was something like 50% of references in philosophical papers are wrong because nobody ever checks. Okay. It was very good discipline. It was also painfully embarrassing the first time. Okay, I had to try to tell law professors and judges who would read this thing what Popper said. Okay. Well, it's no good saying Popper says P. You have to say Popper says P, and there has to be a footnote. And I took advantage of this to have a footnote which gave you a quotation of Popper actually saying P, and chapter and verse. And as I did this, I discovered, oh my God, it's 1,000 times worse than I thought it was. It's not just that no scientific theory can ever be shown to be true, only to be false. No scientific theory can ever be shown to be false either. Why not? Because falsifiable means incompatible with a basic statement. That means with an observation statement. Okay? Some observation statement with which this theory is incompatible. Okay. Falsified, he tells us, means incompatible with an accepted basic statement. Okay. And what makes a basic statement accepted? You would think it was scientists' observations, right? No, sorry. That's psychological. Basic statements are accepted purely by a decision on the part of the scientific community. It's a convention. They make a decision to say, the stuff in the test tube has gone yellow, but how it looks has nothing to do with it. Well, I'm sorry, that means that a falsified statement may not be false. So the whole thing just collapses on itself. I had no idea how bad it was. Apparently Popper didn't until I pointed it out. Sorry, kidding. Most to the present purpose, though, his criterion is, I believe, both too strong and too weak. That's to say, it keeps out some things that really are scientific, and it lets in some things that really aren't. Other suggestions, for example, that all and only scientific theories make predictions, are well tested, make progress, as Loudon once wrote, fail to perform the critical stable clearing for which they were intended. None of these things really works. Anyway, I think the preoccupation with demarcation betrays a misunderstanding of what's really something different. It's a dense mesh of similarities and differences among what we call sciences, they're not all the same, and of continuities and discontinuities with other disciplines. So there really isn't a sharp line where cosmology ends and metaphysics begins. There just isn't, you know. Some of what Peirce wrote maybe you might want to classify as cosmology. Some of what Steven Weinberg writes maybe I would want to classify. There's no way of doing it. There's not really a sharp line between philosophy of mind and studies of the mind by psychologists and medical scientists and such. Not to mention, the demarcationists have this absolute preoccupation with pseudoscience. Don't like this, it's pseudoscience. A totally unhelpful concept. All it tells me is I don't like it, but it doesn't tell me what's wrong with it. And if it's bad stuff, there's something wrong with it. And I want to know what the something is. But calling it pseudoscience is just to insult it without telling you anything. Mythologizing method. Accounts of scientific method tend to be one of two things. Either utterly banal and utterly unhelpful cookbook lists of steps. You know, make a guess, design an experiment, perform the experiment, write up the results, submit them for peer review. Well, does that enable anybody in this room to go away and be a good scientist? Of course not, right? It's empty. It just says these are the steps, but how exactly? Or else it's very subject-specific advice, for example, with respect to epidemiological protocols or archaeological protocols or whatever. I found one very interesting and very successful book on methodology in epidemiology, which opens with utter balderdash about the scientific method, sort of quasi-Popperian balderdash, the usual familiar mix. And then 10 pages in, she just gives it up and says, okay, now, if you're an epidemiologist, this is what you need to know about how to find your sample, how to form your control group, how to present the drug that you're giving them, and so on and so on. But of course, those are no help outside the field. This is no accident, because if I'm right, there is no method used by all and only scientists. There are only the underlying procedures of all serious empirical inquiry, which are not used only by scientists, and the specialized, local, evolving helps to inquiry, which are not used by all scientists. For one thing, they're often local. For another thing, they're evolving, so scientists 100 years ago didn't have them available. Dressing up dreck. Isn't Yiddish a wonderful language? It's got some really marvelous words in it. Sometimes scientific tools are genuinely useful to others, but borrowing these helps to look scientific mistakes the trapping for the substance. Here are two examples of a good use, I think, and a poor use of scientific helps by others. Okay. Historians, apparently, were faced with a problem about how to read the postcards, as they called them, on which Roman soldiers would write home. Okay. They were made of lead with wax on top, and you would write on them with a stylus. And the stylus would leave marks on the lead, because by now the wax is long, long gone. And unfortunately, these lead tablets are also badly weathered. They've been kicking around in the world for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the question is, how do we determine what's writing and what's weathering? And they borrowed some medical imaging technology from the med school and discovered with its help they could distinguish the two. Okay, great. Not so great. Florida fingerprint examiners, bless them, recently conducted a 4-year study to find out, do I mean that? To find out how reliable they were. 4 years, quite a lot of federal money, a lot of statistical apparatus and tables and calculations and etc. And the remarkable conclusion that they were wrong roughly 0% of the time, which makes you think, you think of that old saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. I think where they've gone wrong was, okay, fingerprint examiners use what they call the ACEV methodology. Everybody's got a methodology. Every methodology has an abbreviation. Analysis, comparison, evaluation, ACE, verification. Now, verification sounds as if it means there is some serious control on the first examiner's judgment. Turns out what it means is you take the target print and the one you've matched it to down the hall and you ask Joe, I think this is a match, what do you think? And apparently by the time two have agreed, they've decided it's correct. So a lot of apparatus, a lot of mathematics. Frankly, it's dreck. Colonizing culture. I'm not for a moment denying that by now many questions which were once thought beyond the reach of the sciences have been found to be within their competence after all. For example, Molyneux's problem, whether a man born blind who was given his sight could tell the difference between a cube and a globe, previously known to him only by touch, by looking at them. There have been serious studies of people who have had big, thick cataracts removed. And the answer, interestingly enough, is no, they can't, not right away, but they learn very fast. Of course, it doesn't follow from this that every kind of question is or will eventually be resoluble by the sciences. I don't think it's true. I think even though the boundaries of science are fuzzy and contested, not every legitimate question falls within those boundaries. Now, careful. Religious people often say, science can explain how things happen, but not why things happen. This is an extremely disturbing example from the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew, which was one of my earliest experiences in Miami. It was almost enough to make me run away. After the hurricane, there were, of course, television talked about nothing else for weeks on end. And at one point, they interviewed a pastor whose church had been unscathed by this very destructive natural force. Talked to him about, why did you think your church was saved? And he said, well, you know, their church was just flattened. That's because we're right and they're wrong. Eek. Okay. I am not relying on any such ideas. Okay. What I have in mind is a whole different kind of question. Questions of policy. Formal questions of logic and pure mathematics. Interpretive questions in jurisprudence or in literary scholarship. Evaluative questions in epistemology, in ethics, in aesthetics, and so on. And metaphysical questions of such generality that you need their answers for the work of the sciences even to make sense. So I have in mind, for example, that there is a real world, by which I mean a world independent of how we believe it to be, and that we have the capacity both to sense particular things and events in the world and to make conjectures, generalized conjectures about possible explanations of this. Without answers to those questions, how are these things possible? The sciences would not be possible. And yet, these are not questions that the sciences can answer. Devaluing the difference. This takes many forms. Some people, I think that making music, dancing, telling stories, they're kind of sissy. You know, they're effete. They're inherently inferior to the manly task of forcing nature to give up her secrets. I did say in the paper, putting nature on the rack, thinking that this was Francis Bacon. But I now have good law school habits. I went and checked. And guess what? Bacon never said it. It was Leibniz who attributed this idea to Bacon. So, okay. Well, some people do sort of feel it's, you know, this is not nearly as manly. This is not worthy of grown men, this kind of stuff. Well, that really is just temperament, and there is no arguing with temperament. So I can only say, look, I think our culture, not to mention my life, would be far poorer without the work of scientists, and far poorer without the work of artists, composers, writers, and so on. I can't imagine life without electricity. I also can't imagine life without Mozart. So, others seem to think non-scientific forms of inquiry are inherently squidgy and inferior. I hope that's a word. My computer said it wasn't, and I said, the hell with you. So, okay. And it's true. Serious science requires scrupulous respect for the facts. That's true. Think of that early, hopeless model of DNA that Watson and Crick were so proud of that they invited the London team to come have a look. Rosalind Franklin takes one look at this thing and she says, where's the water? Where does the water go? Right? We knew how much water DNA included. Well, she knew. This model had room for only 10% of the water molecules that it was known DNA included. It was hopelessly wrong. Watson had listened to a lecture of Franklin's in London. He had made notes in the train on the way home, and he'd put the decimal point in the wrong place. But the moral of this story is, what did they do? They didn't try and bluff it out, as you can imagine a philosopher trying to bluff out having been refuted. No. Oh, sorry, back to the drawing board, or actually back to the model shop and the little bits of cardboard and metal and wire and so on. Okay. I think, however, all serious inquiry in whatever field requires the same honesty and the same humility as any serious historian or any serious legal scholar could tell you. I remember once writing in a paper, which luckily I didn't publish, but I did present one time, that so far as I knew, no federal judge had ever excluded psychiatric testimony from the case on Popperian grounds, even though Freudian and Jungian psychiatry are Popper's two prime examples of pseudoscience. I was very glad I didn't publish that paper, because it turns out I was wrong. There is exactly one case in which exactly one federal judge, I can swear, has read at least one page of Popper. I couldn't go any further than that, but still. It would have been extremely embarrassing to have said this in print, so I'm very glad I didn't. I won't talk about the present predilection of at least many universities, I don't know about yours, for favouring what are now called STEM subjects over the humanities and such. That means science, technology, engineering, and math. Some people in the humanities respond to this by arguing until they're blue in the face that a degree in, shall we say, English literature or Sanskrit or, dare I say it, philosophy is really an excellent, excellent tool to have on the job market. I'm not inclined to go that route. I'm inclined to say, let's look at the assumptions behind, about what it is that universities are supposed to be doing, what our goals are supposed to be, what we're trying to achieve, whether we are to be entirely focused on the job market, partly focused, what, and so on. Okay, I think there's a huge confusion here of very complicated, very difficult issues, and just coming out with your banners saying a degree in philosophy will get you all kinds of wonderful jobs. No, I'm not going to go that route. For one thing, it's false. What about denialism? The idea that questions that fall outside the sciences are just illegitimate. For example, as the Churchlands argued, neuroscience, or Stitch argued, cognitive science don't posit beliefs. Epistemology is illegitimate. There are no beliefs, so there's nothing for epistemology to be about. Honestly, it's tempting just to sputter. What? I mean, the idea that only scientific inquiry is legitimate inquiry strikes me as just absurd. That is my reaction. I just want to sputter. Unfortunately, sputtering isn't an argument. It's a shame, but it's not. I have to do better than sputter. I can't do that today, and I don't want to promise more than I can deliver. But tomorrow, I will do my best to show at least for one group of non-scientific questions, that's to say, a bunch of questions in the philosophy of mind, that there is and there must be legitimate inquiry which cannot, in principle, be scientific inquiry. That's the plan for tomorrow. Today,